Is Dungeons & Dragons actually good for you? That is the question my guest and I discuss today.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the show where we learn how to become better game masters and better role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. Now, guys, I say that kind of like almost every podcast episode. If you want to learn what I mean by that, I have written an article on DiceGeeks.com. It is called Game Masters, Fill Yourselves with Stories, where I kind of talk about what I mean by that. If you just head over to DiceGeeks.com, you can find that article and check it out, or you can just type the title right into Google and you will find it. It is just called Game Masters, Fill Yourselves with Stories, and you'll get an idea of what I talk about when I say fill ourselves with stories and knowledge. All right, guys, I have an incredible guest today, and we dive into the culture and the benefits of Dungeons & Dragons. You definitely want to hear this. My guest today is a journalist, critic, poet, author of the book Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks. He is also the speaker behind the TEDx talk, Why Dungeons & Dragons is Good for You in Real Life. Ethan Gilsdorf. Ethan, welcome to the show.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
How were you first introduced to Dungeons & Dragons?
Sure. Well, this is, I guess the best way to begin is to describe the scene. If you want to set the Wayback Machine to the late 1970s, I was a 12-year-old kid in 1979, and I, like probably a lot of people who heard about D&D in those days before the internet, it really was a word-of-mouth kind of thing. There was a new kid had moved across the street from me, and it was the summertime, and he was new to town, and he had learned how to play D&D from the last town he lived in, somewhere else in the country. And we just, because he was my next door neighbor, and I lived in a very small town in New Hampshire where there weren't a ton of choices in terms of like who you were going to hang out with. It was typically the kid on your street. So we just became fast friends, and he taught me and a couple other kids in the neighborhood how to play. And I was off and running. It was really kind of love at first sight. And I remember playing quite a lot that summer. And then the school year began. And me and some other kids in the neighborhood, and as well as kids at school, we found a way to kind of integrate it into our lives. And before we knew it, we were playing every weekend, pretty much straight through till about my last year in high school, essentially.
Okay. What do you think the appeal was to you?
Well, I think at the time it was, it kind of tapped into, a couple different threads in my own psyche or my own, interest. I was definitely a kid who was interested in telling stories. I was already a pretty imaginative kid, and I was interested in science fiction and fantasy. I wouldn't say I was a hardcore, reader of that genre at the time, but I was going to be one very soon. And I also was interested in making movies. I was making Super 8 movies, monster claymation movies and things like that, and trying to do my own version of Star Wars, in 3 minutes or less with a Super 8 cartridge, in a stop motion, movies and those sorts of things. So I was definitely the kind of kid who was attracted to this kind of, open-ended storytelling. And I also was really interested in, I think, acting in some way. And so between those two, and drawing, those are sort of the interests that I had at the time. I was interested in being a cartoonist. So there were lots of ways in which D&D kind of accelerated my interest in these things and got me, as you know, the game is like both imaginative, but also weirdly constrained by all these crazy rules, which are very specific. And, you could be the kind of kid who's super interested in, the charts and the tables and the probabilities and kind of doing the math side of it. Or you can be the kid who's really into kind of the storytelling and the world building and the map making and the dungeon designing and the graph paper and hex paper, which certainly was that was generally more my side. And the kid who taught me how to play was a bit more of a math guy who was into early computer programming, back when people's first introduction to home computing was like the TRS-80 Radio Shack, home computer, where you could design little things using basic language and other things. So I think it was that kind of experience that felt like it was like this structure that allowed me to tell stories and to imagine things, and also, but do it in the context of a social experience, which I think was something I was really, really desperate for at that age.
There just seems to be a lot of commonalities kind of coming out of that late 70s, kind of early 80s, where you have Star Wars, Star Trek resurges with Star Trek the Motion Picture, and filmmaking becomes popular, and then Dungeons and Dragons was just kind of all in that same mix.
Yeah. I mean, it really was sort of it was also the era when, well, of course it was before the internet, people were starting to be able to consume some of the stuff on VHS and Betamax, if anyone remembers those formats, so you could go, if it was a movie or a sort of a cultural thing that you really liked that was, available on VHS, you could do that. And it was also this interesting time, I think, where kids had exposure to those things, and they also had a lot more free, unstructured time. And in particular, in the family that I grew up in, there was a lot of unstructured time and not a whole lot of adult supervision. And so that is the kind of perfect recipe for this kind of thing, where you don't, there weren't like after school activities. We didn't have programmed, things we had to do. The minute school ended until dinner time or weekends, we had a lot of free reign. For people who are, not of my generation or younger, who might be listening to this podcast, the kind of analogy that I use to help sort of get people into the mindset of that era is not to say that the show Stranger Things is entirely accurate, because obviously not everyone's life has supernatural phenomenon and like that, but the era that it evokes, sort of the early 80s, where you're a kid on your bicycle with a backpack and you got your walkie-talkie and you're kind of roaming around, getting into trouble in the woods. I mean, that was pretty much my childhood. And if you needed a ride home, like, you had to find a payphone and hope someone had a pocket full of dimes. I mean, it really is amazing how nicely, that show tapped into both my nostalgia bone, but also I think did a pretty good job of capturing, what that era looked like and felt like in terms of how the kids were. So that was a really kind of a lovely, as that's also contributed to why D&D is, I think experiencing some resurgence, which I know we'll be talking about undoubtedly.
So, of course it was kind of in the culture there. D&D became hugely popular in the culture there, but why do you think D&D is good for a person?
Well, there's always this tiny little bit of like, well, this is something I was really into, and there had to be sort of the sort of more crass, superficial way of looking at it is, I spent all this time, hours, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours. Surely there must have been something good that came out of it. Yeah. And I think, this is not unique to D&D in this regard. I think that lots of people smarter than I, who are, sociologists and psychologists, have looked at a lot of different pop cultural phenomenon, and sort of now through the lens of hindsight, they can sort of look back and say, well, surely these activities weren't just, mindless escapism, or for that matter, the thing that most people worried about at the time, not in my community particularly, but that D&D was some kind of, gateway for satanic activity, and that kids were somehow being schooled, into the world of devil worship and so forth. I mean, we Lord knows we would have loved if we could have summoned demons and cast spells and, actually done the things that the Christian right was really determined, convinced that somehow D&D was actually capable of. So Lord knows we tried in many ways to inscribe our pentagrams on our gaming table and try to make something happen. But in any case, I think that the thing that happened with me that was interesting, and maybe to tell the story a little bit differently, is, I had played D&D for, 8 or 9 years, kind of obsessively. I stopped playing when I went to college. I kind of put all that stuff behind me and really kind of forgot about the game. And this is the story I tell in my book, Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks, that, at the time in the late to early, what am I saying? Late 80s, early 90s, I was in a different place in my life, and I certainly didn't think that my time playing D&D was very useful. But when I discovered the boxes of stuff that I had miraculously saved, from that era, which I amazingly hadn't thrown away, thankfully hadn't thrown away, and rediscovered that about 10 or 15 years ago, I kind of had a different view on this creative outlet that I realized D&D had been for me. I didn't quite see it at the time. And now looking back, I was like, wow, this kid, who is this Ethan kid who is really into this? He was really, really committed. I mean, it was a very engrossing, self-designed, it wasn't like I was in a club at school or I wasn't getting credit for this. It wasn't like a sport team. I wasn't getting institutional support for it. It was just me and my buddies, and our pooled resources, from our weekly allowance, to kind of get some of the gear that you need. And so I began to think about that, and I began to wonder, well, I know for me, number one on the list was finding a communal activity that I was able to do with other kids, because I wasn't the kind of kid who was going to be on a sports team, which for many kids is the pathway, right, for sort of collaborative, problem solving and, being part of a team and sort of that whole regular scheduled sort of, in my case, masculine kind of activity that, would make me feel like I was part of something bigger than me. All that stuff that kids do get from, other groups like band or theater or sports teams. I didn't have that. So for one, I felt like D&D really made a huge difference in socializing me and giving me a kind of communal activity where I could really work together with my friends. So that was one thing that I just could, once I tapped back into that world and looked at all the stuff that I had collected. And then I began to realize, well, as I said earlier, like all the things that I knew that I got really excited about when I was playing the game, because, you have the rule books, but of course not everything is in the rule books, and you need to do research to find out more about, how castles were constructed, or, how did the Romans, organize how do they build ballistas, or, if you wanted to learn about geography or, geology, because you were trying to design something in your game that relied on some kind of plausible, geological event, so there's always ways in which the game is asking people to read beyond the rule books and do research. That was a big part of why the game was appealing to me, was this whole vast knowledge that you could just tap into. In my case, go to the library and find a book on some associated topic. So that's part of it.
And just to kind of pick up on some of the things that you were talking about, it is interesting to think back, I was just thinking back when I had started playing, and I think I think it's a real memory, but I think I honestly remember my mom at one point actually uttering the phrase, "Those games will warp your mind." She's okay with it now that she sees that I can write a book and make money doing it. Yep. So she's happy about that now.
Thank God for that, right? That the culture has turned around, and now this is something that, absolutely seems productive and could be a source of income.
Yeah, absolutely. And then too, just thinking about, you said you found the things that you did when, you were a child, the D&D materials that you created when you were a child. Well, I just a few years ago discovered my childhood character sheets, like the actual character sheets. And,
awesome.
And it was kind of one of those experiences where I was just like, besides realizing how, like that I could not spell like a single word, and that I did not know the rules of Dungeons and Dragons as I was playing them. But, I also realized that it's just how creative I was, that I was just thinking of things that like, I just didn't realize I was thinking of that, like I didn't remember creating some of this stuff when I was 9 and 10 years old or 11 years old. And so that was just kind of a wake up to me, that it was just like, oh yeah, I have always been kind of creating these things.
Yeah. And I had the same experience when I looked at my old stuff too. And I'd honestly forgotten most of it, but many of which were pieces of world building stuff that I had, created that we never even played. I mean, I think that half the time I was just sort of in my bedroom or at the kitchen table, just drawing stuff and coming up with backstories for different temples and castles and, drawing maps, and, 90% of it never got used in the game, but there was always this urge to like keep making more of this, of this fantasy world, and coming up with new corners of the world that I hadn't quite fleshed out yet. And around this time I was beginning to read obviously things like Lord of the Rings. And that is, once you see those maps and you realize how big Tolkien's world building enterprise was. It's intimidating / inspiring because you realize this is something you could really spend years on, which of course he did.
Yeah.
So that was something that I really felt like was I wouldn't say compulsive, but I think that I was very, very, I was just happiest with a pencil in my hand. I mean, that was probably the best way to put it.
And then you were also mentioning how the game forced you to look at things outside of the game and do research.
Yeah.
And because I was just thinking too, because I played the first time when I was 9 and I continued playing, through my teen years. And I had struggled with reading quite a bit in school. But I just have very clear memories of sitting with a rule book that was fairly dense and reading all about the creatures and reading about these things, and I just can't help but to think that playing Dungeons and Dragons actually forced me to read and get better at something that I was struggling with.
Yeah, I think that story is really common with a lot of kids who struggle with reading, and because they they're being assigned something, or their parents are saying you should be reading books, but they're not finding the subject matter is not compelling to them. But when you get a kid who's really interested in it, whether it's a comic book or, the monster manual or whatever it would be, that's a huge incentive for this kid to suddenly, even if they're reading above their sort of pay grade, which I feel like I was constantly reading. I was a good reader, but I remember picking up we played mostly advanced Dungeons and Dragons, and those big, thick rule books that Gygax came up with, which were so complicated and so full of like just the most insane vocabulary words. I mean, it was absolutely, a teaching tool. Had a lot to do with my own development as a writer and being able to flex, just my knowledge of the language.
When would you think like a 13-year-old would spend, some evenings reading a book that's probably too advanced for them and doing math problems of their own, voluntarily, right?
Yeah.
Like when does that happen?
Exactly. And I think for, my own situation at home was a little bit different than maybe other kids, but my mom and the woman who was taking care of us at the time, they were just happy I wasn't getting into trouble. I mean, my brother and sister had particularly in high school, middle schoolers, or at least in those days, were pretty safe, but obviously kids in high school all kinds of bad stuff can, start influencing them. And for them, they were very much more social and going out, and, they were good kids. They weren't troublemakers, but they were going to parties and they were getting into cars and, doing things. And I think that for my family, they didn't really understand what I was doing, but it didn't matter because we were at some kid's house. We weren't drinking beer. We were drinking, Mountain Dew and eating cheese pizza. And we were like the safe kids, we were the ones where like the parents had no reason to worry about any of us, which I'm sure was a big relief, for our social group. And I think the other thing that, I would be remiss not to say, and this is something I talk about in the TED Talk, not only about, sort of the problem solving aspect of any kind of, obviously any kind of D&D adventure, any kind of encounter you have in D&D, there's 17 different ways that if it's well designed, 17 different ways that the players can figure it out, or honestly come up with a different sort of twist on what's actually going on that sort of encourages the game master to improvise and come up with something to kind of meet what they've cooked up in sort of an improvisational way. But also the idea that for kids who are not super assertive, or the kinds of kids who would be leaders in their own social group in high school or middle school, the idea that you can play a character who is all the things that you are not, as a kind of wish fulfillment / test driving, like different aspects of how you could or might be. I think that while I don't know that there's any hard data on this, probably there are people who are writing their dissertations on this right now. I wouldn't be surprised, but the idea that you just grow your own character sort of through the idea of playing these other characters and test out different ways of behaving and thinking. And you can be kind of like that super charismatic or super, fearless guy or gal in the game that you aren't in real life. And maybe that's part of how you figure out how to be who you are, and that's, I think, a really important aspect of any kind of role-playing game, not necessarily D&D, but any kind of situation where you're sort of being asked to sort of adopt a different persona, which has a lot to do with also how people interact with each other. If you can extrapolate some lessons about empathy from D&D, I think that's another strong, for me anyway, in my TED Talk, I talk about this idea that you, by role playing and by sort of test driving these different hypothetical situations, you just learn a little bit more about what's it like to be someone else, or to be an other, whatever the other is, whether it's another race or another creature or another social class or another profession, or even if it's a fantasy world, even if it doesn't have a direct analog to the real world. I think that kids, if the game is played well, and not to say that immature kids won't do immature things in the game as well, which is always I'm sure you had memories of like doing some not so great things, looking back like, oh, did I really say that? And maybe that's a safe place for kids to try out some of this not so great behavior. Also, I don't know if that was your experience, if you remember sort of not great behavior moments in game, too.
Yeah, we didn't get too crazy, but there were certainly some times when it was basically, if you walk into a town, your goal was just to kill as many NPCs or non-player characters as possible. Yep. And it was just like, whereas the dungeon master is like, oh, I had all these encounters planned out. Well, my goal is just to kill everybody in town.
Right. Versus talking to them or getting information or whatever you're supposed to be doing. Yeah,
exactly. I mean, and of course, as a player, you can have kind of fun doing that, for a little while. But then, as for the, I ended up then starting to run more games and having my friends, play in my games. And then I started realizing some of the frustration when I had something planned out like this, kind of at least what I would think would be a cool adventure, and you could explore a dungeon or explore something or a castle or something. And then my players, would say, can we rob a bank?
Right.
And it's just like, you want to rob a bank?
Right.
You can explore this ancient dungeon with all kinds of secret things. No, let's rob that bank,
Okay. Or let's just set up a fireball in the entrance and, go in afterwards, kind of things that I think one thing that's nice about playing the game now as an older person is that I feel like we all get that we've all had those experiences as adolescents where we just kind of did sort of stupid and kind of had a laugh, knowing that, we were just messing with each other. But now there's a bit more respect, like we kind of get that, let's take some of the DM's advice a little bit, and let's appreciate what he or she has spent time creating for us, because give them the benefit of the doubt and kind of go along. And I think that's something a little less, obviously the other thing that gets played out is social interaction skills, in a game where surely the same stuff would happen on a soccer field or a basketball court. You're jockeying with, in my case, mostly boys, teenage boys. How do you settle disputes, not in the game, but like amongst players? Yeah. How do they as a group come to a decision, learning about, things like respect or, empathy, or just kind of being, not being a jerk. There was one really interesting anecdote I was just thinking of when you were saying, players not really appreciating what you were doing as a DM. At one point we had two kind of groups in our town that were playing, and every so often there would be a bit of overlap between the two. But I want to say that we were playing the same module that TSR had come up with, or somehow there was some overlap between the two campaigns. But one group, as their sort of, what they wanted to do that session, they decided to burn down this forest. And I remember the other group took such offense at their decision, and there was this real world sort of, disagreement about it. And it was almost like an ethical situation. Like, how could you have done that? Don't you understand, the meaning of this forest or whatever? I don't remember the details of what the significance of the forest was, but it was a very interesting moment. I remember there weren't that many times when I felt like the problems or the things we were dealing with in the game really being able to spill out into our social lives as teen kids. And we were angry with each other, like we just were not cool with what had happened. It was a really interesting moment. I hadn't thought of that in a long time. It just kind of popped back in my head.
I think there is a bit that's a little bit innocent about it as well, that you just, once you make a character and it has certain abilities, just in the game, you want to try those out.
Yeah.
And especially for Dungeons and Dragons, it's like, well, I've just spent, depending on which edition you're playing, you could spend up to, a half hour to maybe 8 hours creating a character. And you're just like, well, my character swings a sword really well. I want to see him swing a sword. My character casts spells really well. I want to see him cast spells. And so sometimes it can seem like almost like a disconnect that you spend so much time focusing on those aspects of the character. It seems like a disconnect once you come in and say, okay, well, you're supposed to banter with this courtier for, an hour before you get a scrap of, information from something. So I think it can be that sometimes, but I think I do see also sometimes players have kind of an arc, when they first start playing, they're kind of fascinated with the combat aspect, and then they kind of grow into more of the actual kind of role playing or acting side.
Yeah, I think you're right. Yeah, and I think if the game, like any activity, I think if the game is going to stick with you over time, you're probably going to interface or interact with it in different ways. Your sort of engagement with it will shift, and other parts of what the game offers will appeal to you at different places in your life. Because to me, I mean, like in some ways now as a player, the things that are least interesting are sort of the combat. I'm almost more interested in conversations, which is funny. It's a different sort of part of my brain that's getting, tickled, I guess, in that situation.
Yeah. And I kind of feel the same way as well. I mean, don't get me wrong, a fun combat can be exciting. And, when it's run well and played well, there's a lot of appeal in that. But yeah, as I've gotten older and I've played more, I do find myself trying to slip into other people's shoes and really wanting to play the character and see how they would talk and react to people and do different things like that.
Yeah, I'm working with a group of high school kids right now, and we've been playing just at a local high school here in Providence where I live. It's like an after school club, and I'm kind of the leader, dungeon master. And, I want the kids to have a good time, and I want them to learn the game and, just experience part of what I experienced. And I'm also, trying to teach them how to be, hoping that some soft skills get developed as a result of it. And it's interesting to push the kids a little bit and ask them to talk a little bit more about their characters and a little bit more about, like, if, what would your character do, or how does your character talk, or tell me something about your character that would influence or, have some impact on the way they might react to this particular situation. And just kind of pushing the kids. And there have been some really nice moments where the kids have really realized they are, they have an ethical question that they're trying to grapple with, or they're trying to, as a group, figure out how to come up with a good solution to a problem, and appreciating that amongst them. And watching 15-year-old kids or 16-year-old kids do that in real time is a really interesting full circle experience for me, having been super into this as a kid, and then having not played for such a long time.
Just thinking back, when I was playing when I was a kid, I think there was an idea that the games cut you off socially and stunted you socially, and that you were just in a fantasy world all the time, and that you were ignoring things in the real world. And it does seem, though, to me like that there's just been not only just a total shift in the perception of that. It just seems, of course, thinking back, that just wasn't true in most cases.
And I think it was just people's fears about, I think, kids doing things in private, and maybe, as I said before, like we were talking about, the fears of Satanism, and there was all the stuff around heavy metal at the time that was really controversial. And what I've noticed, and this has a lot to do with, I think, where D&D is at now in the culture, is that I think parents are really excited that their kids are engaged in something like this, because it means that they're not, it's less screen time. They're not just staring into their smartphones. And it doesn't matter what the content is. It's the fact that, because I have a rule when I play with these kids, like no devices at the table. And we try to look each other in the eye and sort of try to interact, as well as we can, sort of in the real world. And I think for a lot of parents, they're just desperate for some activity that is engaging. Again, for the kids who wouldn't be on a sports team, or, obviously those have their own, rules and sort of culture where you're not obviously going to be on your cell phone while you're playing, a sport. But, for these kids who are not going to be part of that experience, parents are, I think, understandably, really excited by, and they can see that it's laughable to think that this has a corrupting, or as you said, warping, impact. It's also, for those parents who are still a little wary of all the time that kids play video games. I mean, this is, certainly fantasy violence in the same vein as a video game, but it feels, I'm sure, for many parents very, much safer and much more wholesome than a video game, which, obviously that's a whole nother ball of wax that, is obviously.
We could talk about that for like 10 hours and
totally
scratch the surface of that. Yeah.
It's just funny how it shifts, as you said earlier, 20 years ago or 50 years ago, people were worried about this, and then it was this, and it used to be comic books and rock and roll music. And then it was rap music. It's just, there's always a new enemy.
Yeah.
That parents are focusing all their energies on, as if that's somehow any different than, what's come along before in the previous generations.
And it's just kind of hard to think of a parent being upset that 3 or 4 teenagers, like their teenager, son or daughter, and 3 or 4 of their friends are in their room reading books that are teaching them more vocabulary, solving math problems, and then wrestling with ethical problems about burning down a forest or not.
Yeah.
Other than, out someplace drinking or something. I don't see
exactly. I know
why that would be a problem.
And I think honestly, the other thing that's really obviously has happened is that now that there's generations now of experience with this game, it's been in the culture for, whatever it's been now, 45 years. So even if the parents of kids today didn't play D&D, they knew about it, and now they're seeing shows like Stranger Things, and they're seeing, all the streaming shows online. I mean, the internet is the thing that's really, I think, sort of turned a corner on all this, because it is so clearly demystified what the game is, and also, for skeptics, has demystified it. And I think for parents, for players who never really understood what the game was and thought it was too weird or too nerdy or too complicated, if you just sit down and watch any of these episodes of streaming, you see it's just people having fun and laughing, and for sure there's some rules involved, but it makes the on-ramp just so much lower, and people, I think, can see, oh, this is actually, fun, and it's customized. We can customize this to have it be what we want it to be. How much more interesting is that than just watching TV, or watching a movie? It's like, we can make this what we want it to be. And I think the folks who make D&D, Wizards of the Coast, have been honestly pretty brilliant in figuring this out. This is what's the secret sauce here,
Yeah, and I think a couple of the points you there can lead us into another topic that you started mentioning, the internet and streaming, and then a previous generation having played, and then a new generation coming in and playing. It's just that kind of in the late 70s, early 80s, D&D enjoyed a height of popularity, but then it kind of faded from view. But now it is resurging, and it is more popular than ever. Seeing the Player's Handbook, the #1 best-selling book on Amazon, for instance, is just kind of shocking to me.
Yeah. It really is.
And it's just kind of an amazing thing coming from a time for me, where it's just like you were borderline. You might as well have said, on some occasions, and to some people, you might as well have said, I'm doing heroin as I'm playing Dungeons and Dragons,
Yeah, right.
But now, it's just enjoying this resurgence. And I was just wondering if you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of factors that have, resulted in that. And I think it is, as I mentioned, the internet is big, obviously, in making people connect and find out what, easily accessible information or models of how you might play this, which is so different than back in the day. The old thing that I always say, because now that I'm in my 50s, like back in the day, we had to do this and do that, get a ride to the mall or send away a stamped self-addressed envelope to Lake Geneva, Wisconsin, to get a catalog of, it wasn't really very good looking, product list. And you would sort of put a check in the mail and random stuff would show up, primitive mail order like we have in Amazon. But I mean, I think it took more work, and it was definitely, while as you said, there was a few years where probably you could go to Kmart or some of the big, in those days, box stores that had D&D products for the couple of years when it was the very popular toy or gift you would get a kid for Christmas. it was harder. And I think the internet makes it so much easier to see, to connect with other groups and to find out how I would learn about how to play. If I can't find kids in my school, I can go on to other websites and learn about how to connect with people who might be interested in this, and not just D&D, but all the associated pop culturally, pop culture, nerd culture things that were certainly also like D&D, kind of very much in the shadows. And I think the success of big movie franchises like Lord of the Rings and Harry Potter and now with Marvel surging, and of course Star Wars, all of these things that I think people understand the basics of what a fantasy world is or a science fiction world, and they have a kind of working knowledge of that. So the basic concepts of what a wizard might be, or who Gollum is, or I don't know, the magic ring, or a kid who might become a wizard, all of these things are kind of tropes now that I think 25, 50 years ago weren't nearly as familiar and popularized or mainstream. So it's not hard for kids to say, oh, I get what that is. I can see how that world is appealing. So that's certainly a huge part of it. You have this amazing, obviously the big publishing companies in Hollywood have figured out that there is an appetite for this kind of storytelling, whether it's a game or whether it's a movie or whether it's a book. And I think D&D has done a great job of capitalizing on that. And also I think bringing old people like me back into the game, because it was not something that really felt like we were, I think a lot of my friends, were like me. They played it at a certain time in their lives, and then they put it sort of back in the closet. And now I think, a lot of older, adults feel like this is something that I could get back into, and that's okay. I could teach my kids how to play because this is something I played when I was 12 or 9 or 15. Lots of folks I know are playing with their kids or teaching their kids, hoping to introduce them to it. And that makes that's a powerful experience, I think, for a parent. I'm not a parent myself, but I do have nephews, and I've taught them how to play. And so who doesn't want to have that experience of teaching that to your kids in the hopes that it will catch fire with them, I think that's a powerful impulse, in the same way that you pick up a baseball and a glove and go to the backyard and play catch with your kids, So I think it's similar, but different.
And I think too, like I had mentioned, I played D&D the first time when I was 9. That was 1982.
Yeah.
And one thing that just kind of blew my mind is, so I played for a while, but like one thing that would just totally blew my mind is I never would have thought that people would like to watch or listen to people play Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
But obviously they do. And a lot of them do, with obviously shows like Critical Role and some of the other popular ones. And it's just, to me, that just like, I just did not see that coming.
Me neither. Or for that matter, watching people play video games.
Yeah. Oh gosh. I can still barely get my head around that one.
Yeah.
Seeing some of my older nephews and stuff, just, they'll be playing a video game while watching somebody play a video game on a different screen.
Yeah.
My kids are still kind of young for that yet, but I still don't know how I feel about that exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's different strokes for different folks. I mean, it is, to me, I also still don't find, I think that the idea that they're streaming, live play games of D&D happening and archived, and, you can watch pretty much, any hour of the day, you can watch a new game. Mm-hmm. I think that's great for the industry. As a personal choice for how I would want to spend my time, it's not something I would necessarily want to do, just because it's much more fun to play than it is to watch other people play. But I get it if you're looking for inspiration, or some of these actors, particularly the like Critical Role, like they are some of them are talented voice actors, and absolutely. They are just entertaining to watch because they're so good at what they do. Mm-hmm. And that's often a good, I get a little charge of adrenaline and recharge my battery when I'm like, I can't think of what to do with my, group of like the high school group that I'm working with. And you just watch a few minutes of that and you're like, okay, this is what it is. This is how you do it. Give yourself a little shot.
Yeah. I mean, obviously there's a whole bunch of factors involved and I'm no expert, but I think too, just like the kind of the changing nature of jobs that young people have is that you're able to listen to podcasts or music while you work.
Yeah.
While you design a website or while you're working, on something like that. And so you can just consume that content while you're putting together a website or categorizing, different thing, putting together an email for an e-commerce company that you're working.
Yeah, exactly. And before, like the only way to be able to sort of immerse yourself in the game was to have just to be playing it or to pick up a book and read it. And it was other than just daydreaming,
Mm-hmm.
But this idea that you can experience the genre or the sort of, the entertainment, this new category of entertainment, which is remarkable. You think of, the popularity of like the Adventure Zone podcast, which is so huge. And, in this piece that I did for the New York Times back in November, it's called In a Chaotic World, Dungeons and Dragons is Resurgent. It sort of explores these questions. And I talked to one of the McElroy brothers who's part of that. And it's just, he told me that their podcast has been downloaded 150 million times. I mean, the idea that just the Adventure Zone, they have other podcasts, just the D&D themed one. It's astounding, to think that there's that many people, and not all those are D&D players, but they might want to play D&D, or at least now they know what it is.
Yeah.
To me, that's just mind-boggling. Really, really impressive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was one of the questions that kind of course, gets answered by being able to stream something or watch something like that is when we were young, it was like, how do you actually play the game?
Yeah.
Because it's not Monopoly, it's not Life or anything like this. It's, how do you actually play? And so like, some of my friends had never played before, but I had played with other friends. And so I was able to kind of show them. But like, if you just picked up the book, I think it took a very kind of special person just to pick up a book blank without any idea of how to play and just figure out how to play.
Yeah. I know I have a neighbor here whose dad had one of the original, OD&D box sets, like the three pamphlets in the box, and he played. And I never really leafed through one of those sets, and I looked through them because he let me borrow it. His dad found it in his attic and said, want to take a look. And in any case, I read through those books, and I'm like, there's actually very little useful information about how to play the game. There's all kinds of information on the sort of statistical side of how you would, the effects of different things and monsters and characters, but the very little actual, what would the game actually sound like? How would you sort of set it up? Like, what would one person say? What would someone else say? And even in the version of D&D we played, there was very little. It was some of that, but it wasn't really as much as you would have thought. Like that's the hard part is just like getting the kind of banter right and sort of figuring out how this sort of social exchange happens around a table, because I can imagine so many kids played it so differently, just compared based on what they thought how it should be played, and I guess that's the beauty of the game, it is adaptable enough that you can play different ways, as suits your party, your group.
Well, Ethan, I could probably go on talking to you all day about this stuff. I love Dungeons and Dragons and all this stuff. So, but I will try to respect your time here. Where can people find out more about you and learn about your work and that? Sure.
Well, the best place is my website. I don't do the greatest job of updating it, but usually stuff that I've done that's new and recent is posted on my blog, which is on the homepage. So it's my first and last name.com. So it's ethangilsdorf.com, which is a bit of a mouthful. That's the one that everybody, when they hear Ethan Gilsdorf, they immediately assume that I'm a Tolkien character, or that it was destined that I became a D&D player, because it's clearly an Elvish or Dwarvish name. So ethangilsdorf.com, and you can learn about my book, Fantasy Freaks and Gaming Geeks, which is my sort of travel memoir, exploration of D&D and other sort of fantasy fandom cultures. And, there's links to my TED Talk there, as well as some of the classes I teach, and, other articles that I've written that are recent, and other activities and, things that I'm doing, events that I'm doing, mostly in the New England area. I'm based in Providence, which is not that far from Boston. So I tend to tend to do most of my stuff locally to the sort of New England area, but I can be persuaded. So let me know.
Okay, well, I will provide links to your website and to your TED Talk and to your book in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So, Ethan, it was just an absolute pleasure to speak with you today. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Likewise, Matt, really, really appreciated, you're reaching out to me, and I'm glad we got a chance to hang out and nerd out on all the stuff that we both love so much. I just think it's terrific. So thanks, and good luck with everything at the podcast, and hopefully our paths will cross in the real world someday soon.
All right, there you have it, guys. I really hope you enjoyed this conversation that I had with Ethan today. Oh my goodness, I had a blast just talking to him. I could go on and on just asking him questions about Dungeons and Dragons, about geek culture, and more. But obviously, I had to let him go at some point. Now, if you want to learn more about Ethan and his work, if you want to check out some of the articles that he has written, if you want to check out his book that he has written, or if you want to listen to his TED Talk, head over to dicegeeks.com and just look for this episode. In the show notes, I have provided links for you where you can find all of those things, and you can learn a ton about Ethan and his work. Now, guys, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free, and you will get 10 free dungeon maps and more. Plus, you'll never miss an episode of this show. At the end of each show, I do ask you if you would consider supporting the show on Patreon. You could head over to patreon.com/dicegeeks and consider supporting the show. That would mean the world to me. But if you can't do that, I understand completely. If you want to support the show, but you can't do it financially, you can subscribe to the podcast. You can leave an honest review in whatever podcatcher that you use. All of those things help build an audience for the show, and I really want more and more game masters and role players to hear some of these interviews that I'm conducting so they can learn from my guests and become better game masters and better role players. Now, I thank you so much for listening, guys, and until next time, keep gaming.